I think it should be acknowledged and recognized that we could address this issue in different ways without completely rethinking water management in the West.
Welcome to the On Land Podcast, the voice of stewardship in the American West. I'm Jake Lebsack with Western Landowners Alliance. For our latest episode of On Land, I'm thrilled to share this recent conversation between Morgan Wagoner, WLA's Western Water Program Director, and Zak Podmore, author of the Life After Deadpool, Lake Powell's Last Days and the Rebirth of the Colorado River. This discussion comes at a time when the upper and lower Colorado River Basin states are deeply divided over proposals for reducing water usage after the current rules expire in 2026. Despite the threats of climate change and the uncertainties of future hydrology, negotiations remain at an impasse over how to address chronic water shortages. In the face of these realities, however, Life After Deadpool challenges the idea that the West's water issues are insurmountable and inspires us to envision a future where the Colorado River flows freely once more. Now, enjoy the episode.
Hi, Zach, and thanks for being with us today.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I really enjoyed your new book, Life After Deadpool, Lake Powell's Last Days and the Rebirth of the Colorado River. It's a fascinating exploration of the West's relationship with a place that has been profoundly impacted by our water management policies and infrastructure. It's an insightful examination of how we in the West might re-examine our relationship with the river and the ecosystems that supports and the communities that rely on it. Why did you decide to write this book?
I grew up running rivers. I grew up in Glenwood Springs, Colorado, running rivers with my family in Utah and the Colorado and Green and San Juan. And I had heard the story of Glen Canyon many times on those river trips of, the best river trip in the world, the one that we'd never get to see because it was flooded under Lake Powell. And I kind of wrote off, Glen Canyon as a place that was lost for many centuries to come at least. And I was really fascinated when I went on a trip with 25 scientists with the Returning Rapids Project in 2021. I was writing an article for the Salt Lake Tribune where I was working at the time, and the story of, Glen Canyon Dam as a beautiful place that was lost to Lake Powell when the environmentalists lost this battle in the 1950s and 60s turned out to not really be relevant anymore to what was happening in Glen Canyon right now. So, since the year 2000, there was so much that had changed since Lake Powell was last full, and the dam was not serving the functions that it was intended to serve. It was barely storing any water in the system. It was producing less hydropower than ever. Most of the boat ramps were sitting at the top of cliffs and were completely useless in 2021 and 2022. And the idea that the Glen Canyon Dam was going to be there for centuries to come didn't seem as certain as it had once seemed. And the ecological rebirth that was happening in Glen Canyon was so exciting that I realized that in a strange way, there's kind of a positive climate change story happening in Glen Canyon that was accidental, but seemed very significant and seemed like it could teach us a lot for adapting and thinking about climate change outside of the Colorado River.
The book examines the unintended positive outcomes that have occurred as river flows have decreased, but water use has remained the same. This has resulted in historically low reservoir levels. Can you speak to what restoration we're seeing in the canyons and what's being monitored?
Yeah, absolutely. Lake Powell hasn't been full since 1999, and it used to be 186 miles in length up the Colorado River, but it had a pretty big footprint spilling out into all these tributary canyons up the Escalante River, up the San Juan River, up the Colorado River. And as of its low point, its record low level in the spring of 2023, there were over 100,000 acres of land that had once been covered by Lake Powell but had been re-exposed from the low water levels. Lake Powell is around 20% full last spring. So we have a really good track record now of what happens to the landscape when it has a chance to recover, especially in these side canyons. There's over 100 of them. Most of them have flowing streams year-round. And the elevations of the lake that have been haven't been flooded since the year 2000 when this drought began have a remarkable recovery occurring on them. There's 60, 70-foot tall cottonwood trees that have sprung back up in these side canyons. Beavers have moved back in, damming the streams. There's 10-foot stands of willow and other native species around the little beaver dams and reservoirs, and just a huge diversity of wildflowers and native bees. And it's an incredible to explore these places and to see the trash from Lake Powell in the 1980s when it was full. You can see old beer cans and stuff, mixed in with this wild ecological rebirth that's occurring there. So it's an interesting landscape, but it's one we don't have to guess about what would happen if Lake Powell started to disappear, since it's been low for so long at this point.
Yeah. Can you speak to the value of that natural and unintended restoration?
Yeah, I think I can't think of a place in the Western U.S. that has ecological restoration occurring on the scale of what's occurring in Glen Canyon right now. Usually don't get a chance to have 100,000 acres of land that have been completely altered by being a desert landscape suddenly under a reservoir and then starting to come back to life. And I think the value is, Glen Canyon was famous for the controversies around it when the Glen Canyon Dam was being built in the 1950s and 60s. The area would almost certainly be a national park today if it wasn't under Lake Powell, and it was, immortalized in a lot of Southwest literature for being a mistake from an environmental perspective. And the value we're getting from the areas that are recovering in the higher elevations of the lake is that we can see how landscape rebounds from that kind of total blanket impact like a reservoir. And the trends are very positive there. It's you'd expect a bunch of invasive species to come back in, or that's kind of what we have in mind, or even ecologists I talk to expected to see that sort of thing. But in these side canyons, the native species and a great diversity of native species are outcompeting the invasive species in side canyon after side canyon. So there's just a really healthy, diverse ecosystems that are returning in these canyons. And I think that, I was drawn to this story and trying to write this book because that gave me a lot of hope for, other places. If we give Glen Canyon a chance to recover, we have proof that it's recovering on its own without any active management from land managers. There's nobody out there removing invasive species or planting native species. It's just occurring completely on its own accord. And I didn't answer your questions earlier about monitoring, but there's very little monitoring happening from federal agencies of this landscape at this point. There's kind of a group of scientists who have gotten interested in this landscape that aren't working for the federal government that have started to try and quantify the rates of recovery in these side canyons and explore other aspects of the changes out there. It's pretty minimal. It's a basic survey level effort at this point. There's a big disconnect between the scale of the recovery in Glen Canyon and the promising trends we're seeing there, and a big disconnect between that and the actual level of resources and management, monitoring, and research that's being done there. It's pretty low on the latter half of that equation.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. And one of the things that you highlight is the return of the native species. It was long thought that that these ecosystems would not recover, and that the only thing that would come back would be invasives. And that's really being challenged in this landscape. That restoration, however, is under threat as the Bureau of Reclamation and the state strive to refill the reservoirs. As you mentioned, April 2023, Lake Powell had dropped to an all-time low since filling. It was well into what they call the buffer pool, or the elevation that they tried to keep above minimum power pool. But this summer, it had rebounded, I think, almost 67 feet. And when I was down there, there were huge cottonwoods with their green tops sticking out of the lake, clearly doomed. Is there a holistic way maybe that we could consider this natural restoration when we consider how we manage the lakes and the waters and that water elevation behind Glen Canyon?
I think it should be taken into account as we try to make management plans for the future of what's happening, at least, acknowledging what's happening on the landscape, which hasn't been done very much from, the NEPA analysis that are going on around the 2026 guidelines, which we'll get into later. Yeah, it's interesting time. When I was writing the book, Lake Powell was breaking record low levels every week pretty much. From 2021 when I started to the spring of 2023 when I wrapped up the reporting for the book. And as you mentioned, that was the all-time record low, 20% full on Lake Powell. We had a really good snow year, really good runoff year in 2023, almost a record year in parts of Utah and well above average throughout the basin. And even with that great year, Lake Powell went from 20% full to 40% full. And we're still below the levels we were at in just 2019. So we saw, I saw the willows and cottonwoods getting flooded out as well when I went back after the water started to rise. It was sad to see that, but those higher elevations, didn't get flooded. So, the places that have had 24, 25 years to recover now are still continuing their progress towards restoration, and we lost a lot of the succession that had started at the lower elevations of the lake that had only had a few years to start to regrow, but there's still a ton of value out there since 60% of the water that used to be in Lake Powell was missing even at the reservoir's height. I think it's down to around 36 or 35% right now on Lake Powell. So I think there's a hesitancy from land managers and even big environmental groups to acknowledge what's happened in Glen Canyon, because that's if you look at the recovery that's occurring there and look at the ecological values, look at the cultural values, it starts to have implications for how water should be managed throughout the basin. I think it's hard to acknowledge what's there and then say it doesn't really matter. It's easier to just kind of ignore it. So there was Glen Canyon National Recreation Area had some federal comments on a NEPA report like last year, and they kind of implied that all the areas that had once been flooded by Lake Powell and were now out of the water were really low ecological value, that they were kind of covered in invasive species, which is true in some areas, but definitely not true in the majority of these side canyons. So I think that's an easier answer to give, because then if there is enough water to refill Lake Powell at some point, which climate science doesn't suggest there will be necessarily, but we want to keep our options open. Water managers, land managers would like, land managers on Glen Canyon National Recreation Area would like to see Lake Powell at full pool again, if that were possible from a hydrological perspective. But if you start to do a lot of research, you start to promote and understand what's happened in the reservoir bed, it would be more difficult to just let it all flood again. And I think it's a problem, as I mentioned, with environmental groups too, because their focus, the water is so complex, as you know, throughout the West with water rights. And then just from an ecological perspective, the Grand Canyon is so important and gets so much attention, and it's just downstream of the Glen Canyon Dam. It's easy to just focus on trying to protect endangered species and ecological values in the Grand Canyon and to kind of write off Lake Powell and Glen Canyon because they've been written off for so long since the battle over the Glen Canyon Dam was lost in the 1960s. So it's an interesting situation we're in, and it's interesting to follow what the trends are from the policy perspective as well, and not just the ecological perspective.
I'd like to drill down a little bit onto the interests of the environmental groups, specifically with this view that the reemergence of Glen Canyon and its tributaries, due to the low reservoir levels, have an innate trade-off for fish species in the Grand Canyon. This is often called the green versus green trade-off. And in this situation, the thinking goes that the high lake levels that inundate Glen Canyon also provide cold water that prevents the predatory smallmouth bass from reproducing below the dam and the Grand Canyon and threatening the endangered humpback chub. I'd love to know your thoughts on if this is a trade-off of our own making, if there's another way to potentially view the recovery of the humpback chub and the impacts of the dam on them.
Yeah, it's a really interesting situation as well. The humpback chub are largely endangered in the first place because of all these big dams being built. Also, the razorback sucker and some of the other, the pike minnow, some of the other endangered species in the Colorado River Basin. These species evolved for warm, muddy waters that would go shrink down to a trickle, even in the Grand Canyon at some parts of the year, and then have huge floods at other parts of the year or during other years. And they're very, patient species. I think it takes about 7 years for a humpback chub to reach sexual maturity, and they can live for over 30 years. So they're evolved to be able to wait for the right conditions to reproduce, and with all the fluctuations that occur in the natural river ecosystem. The dams, level everything out, right? So there's not as big of floods as we used to see. There's not as low of flows as we used to see. And in the Grand Canyon, most of the sediment that used to run through the Grand Canyon is now being trapped in Lake Powell. And the warm waters that used to come down through the Grand Canyon in the summer are now often very cold from being, at least, until very recently, the water that was coming out of Lake Powell through the Glen Canyon Dam was coming from such a deep level in the lake that the water was freezing at Lee's Ferry and at the start of the Grand Canyon, just downstream from the dam. As you know, you've been there. Even when it's 120 degrees outside, it can be pretty hard to jump into the water if it's 40-something degrees. That was a huge problem for the native endangered fish because they weren't evolved to those conditions. But there's been a pretty successful endangered species recovery program in the Grand Canyon for humpback chub, and that was partly due to the fact that the Grand Canyon was kind of sealed off as its own little laboratory. There weren't a lot of invasive fish in the Grand Canyon. There's Pierce Ferry Rapid on one end by Lake Mead, which formed in Lake Mead sediment, which usually prevents lake fish from swimming upstream into the western Grand Canyon, and then the Glen Canyon Dam was preventing all the invasive sport fish that are stocked in Lake Powell from getting into the Grand Canyon. So this is an argument for a long time of we shouldn't risk modifying the Glen Canyon Dam, as people have talked about since it was built, because then there would be all these new inputs into the Grand Canyon ecosystem that would endanger the endangered fish even further by introducing new variables in the very controlled recovery programs that are going on down there. But this argument kind of fell apart in recent years because Lake Powell got so low. The water level, the warmer water at the top of the lake, got close enough to the hydropower penstocks on the dam. The mainway water is released through the Glen Canyon Dam, and smallmouth bass were sucked through the dam, somehow survived a trip through the turbines and ended up in the Grand Canyon. And this is a disaster for endangered fish recovery programs in the Grand Canyon. They've been dumping chemicals into the stretch between the Glen Canyon Dam and Lee's Ferry to try and knock back the smallmouth bass populations. It hasn't been entirely successful. And then this year, they've been releasing water from the lowest outlets on the Glen Canyon Dam, the river outlet works, which are at that Deadpool level that we'll talk about. And the idea there is to keep the water cold enough that the smallmouth bass won't spawn, and that's worked so far as I know this year. But every time they use those lowest outlets on the dam, no hydropower is produced. And it's kind of ironic that we're trying to get cold water into the Grand Canyon when it was cold water that was, very stressing on the endangered native species in the first place. But it's kind of the situation we're in, trying to respond to something that could become a big problem throughout all of Grand Canyon. And there doesn't seem to be a way to completely eliminate smallmouth bass from the Grand Canyon at this point. It seems to be more responding to or trying to control the population as opposed to eliminate it. So I think that changes the argument for modifying the Glen Canyon Dam, at least in my mind. I'm not a fish biologist. There's a lot of other factors that have to be considered when you're talking about a big change like that. But there are smallmouth bass in the Animas River. There's no barrier between the Animas River and the San Juan River. But the San Juan River, like the Colorado, is really muddy. It's even much muddier than the Colorado. And the smallmouth bass don't travel into the Utah section of the San Juan River. It just gets too silty. They turn around. They're better suited for clear water. So I've heard discussion around the campfire. I don't think there's any scientific papers on this that I'm aware of, that if the Glen Canyon Dam were modified to allow Lake Powell to be completely emptied, the water coming out of Glen Canyon would be so muddy for a long time, both the natural sediment load that's in the San Juan and Colorado rivers, but also the sediment that would be washing out of Glen Canyon that's collected there since the dam was built, that it might kind of solve the smallmouth bass problem. Catfish can survive in muddy water. That might be something of an issue, but the lake fish, the smallmouth bass, the walleye, all those would probably not be able to, establish a big population in the Grand Canyon because it would just be too silty for them. And at the same time, the native species are used to that, so they might actually do better than they've been doing. But I'm just speculating on that front. But it seems if the kind of barrier has already been breached for keeping the species out of the Grand Canyon. So I think that's just one more argument that it might be time to look more closely at modifying the Glen Canyon Dam.
Right. Giving those native species back the environment that they evolved in might be supportive of them. Speaking of the sediment contained in Lake Powell is highly contaminated. There's numerous heavy metals and uranium. Can you speak to the ecosystem and potentially the human health risks from regularly drying and resubmerging those sediments and potentially reanimating them at the surface level?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on this issue, but there are a lot of heavy metals and uranium that have collected in Lake Powell, just like everything that's not water collects in Lake Powell. Every bit of sediment or contaminant ends up, or the vast majority of it ends up settling to the bottom of Lake Powell as the muddy waters flow into the lake at the upstream edges, and then clear water flows out of the dam. All that sediment is being trapped in the reservoir bed. There's a lot of old mines in the Colorado River Basin, Upper San Juan by Silverton, a bunch of others. There's acid mine drainage problems. There's a lot of heavy metals entering the ecosystems through that legacy of gold mining and other mining. And then there's uranium tailings that wash into the river, old uranium mills. I don't know. I mean, this is a problem throughout the basin, right? It's all being collected in Lake Powell, but there's a lot of those heavy metals present along like the San Juan River, for example. I think maybe the dangers aren't as big in Glen Canyon of allowing the sediment to be re-exposed as a place like the Salton Sea or the Great Salt Lake, which have much longer timeline of metals and contaminants collecting in those basins, and are much closer to huge population centers. So you hear the nightmare kind of scenario from the Great Salt Lake. If it were to dry up, there'd be these huge flats of highly toxic dust that would start blowing directly into Salt Lake City. I think it's not as severe in Glen Canyon, and in a lot of the sediments that have been re-exposed, there's pretty good cover, unlike the Great Salt Lake, which is too salty, or the Salton Sea. Doesn't really have a lot of plant life that's going to come up there if it were re-exposed, because it's the Great Salt Lake. But on the Lake Powell sediments, there's a lot of grasses, a lot of native species in the wetter areas. There's willows that are holding that sediment in place more or less. So you don't have you wouldn't have massive wind dust events like you'd see in other areas. At least I don't think you would. But it's still an issue that we need to be aware of and monitor.
We're in a new chapter of conservation. In the first chapter of conservation in this country, you had wilderness and then you had city. But today, more and more, we understand that there's this very important piece in the middle that we call the working landscape.
That is Leslie Allison, CEO of the Western Landowners Alliance.
These are the places that provide our food, our fiber. They provide the jobs that sustain the rural communities. These things are incredibly important, and they're disappearing. And that's really our next challenge going forward. We have to think beyond protected wilderness. And you can't do that unless you're engaging the people in those landscapes, first and foremost in that solution.
Led by the people on the ground, Western Landowners Alliance advances policies and practices that sustain working lands, connected landscapes, and native species.
What we're seeing in the West today is incredibly hopeful, because you do see collaborations, working with partners, trying to realize this vision that's so important to us. I think many places in the rural West are actually leading the way on this.
And so can you. Join us and learn more at westernlandowners.org.
Yeah, it seems like, in my thoughts at least, that preserving that plant life that has come back and is stabilizing those sediments would be really important in making sure that we don't increase the risk of that. One of the things that we are seeing are mud volcanoes. Have you seen these? Have you lit any of them on fire?
Yeah, these are pretty wild. I was hanging out with some geologists who are studying the sediment in Lake Powell, and they showed me a video of this. They look like 3 or 4 foot high shield volcanoes. They're kind of like a bubbling cauldron of mud that's spilling over and raising up in these mud flats. So there's wet bubbles coming out of the middle of this little mini volcano, and then wet mud sediment sliding down the sides. And they're not super common, but I've seen them in a few places. And the geologist showed me a video of them, leaning over the volcano with a lighter and getting a little bit of flame to sputter out of it, and proving that it's methane coming out of that vent from decomposing matter in the lake sediments. So after I saw that video, next time I came across one of the volcanoes, I had to give it a try. So I had similar results, a tiny bit of flame, but anti-dam activists for a long time have, pushed back on the idea that hydropower is carbon-free or, climate neutral, I should say. That's green, renewable energy, because the decomposing matter in the lake bed is a huge source of greenhouse gas emissions, especially if you build a dam in a place like the Amazon. You can imagine how much organic matter is going to both carbon and methane is going to be released from that lake bed. But even in the desert, even in Glen Canyon, there's, you can see the methane coming right out of the ground. You can light it on fire, and there's not there hasn't been enough research to quantify exactly how much methane is being released from the lake bed, but it's certainly there in quantities you can discern from the naked eye on some places.
So back to the sediment, one of the tributaries to the Colorado that comes in to Glen Canyon is the San Juan River. And it carries almost as much sediment as the Colorado River, though a much smaller amount of water. That delta was upstream significantly of the confluence of the two rivers before the lakes started dropping. Under falling reservoir conditions, that sediment front is moving downstream at an incredible rate. I believe the book says somewhere around 100 feet per day. When that sediment front inevitably reaches the main stem of the Colorado River, what will that do to the lake and to management and to recreation on the lake?
Yeah, it's fascinating to hang out as I got to do for the book with the people who are studying the sediment issue. So maybe first we should just talk a little bit about how the sediment works in Lake Powell, because it's something I didn't understand before I started working on the book. If you've been to the upper reaches of Lake Powell and Cataract Canyon or around Height or on the lower San Juan River, you'll see these big banks of sediment, which geologists refer to as the Dominy Formation, after Floyd Dominy, who was the infamous commissioner of the Bureau of Reclamation in the 1960s. And the Dominy Formation is all the dirt, all the sediment, all the mud that's been collecting in Lake Powell since 1963 when it started to fill. And I was under the impression, because that visual of floating through the Dominy Formation canals in a place like Cataract Canyon is so stunning and so memorable, that if Lake Powell were to disappear tomorrow, you'd see a canal of mud going through the heart of Glen Canyon. But that's really not the case because of these deltas that you mentioned. The vast majority of the sediment is stuck in the upstream reaches of the reservoir bed, so in Cataract, on the San Juan. And as soon as the river, which is often flowing on top of 200 feet of Dominy Formation, above its historic lake or historic riverbed level, it flows on top of the mud, picks up mud as it goes, hits the upstream limit of Lake Powell, and as soon as the current stops, as soon as the river hits the reservoir, you can see the sediment sinking to the bottom of the lake right before your eyes. So this creates what is referred to in the book as a kind of mud glacier that's filling the canyon, also known as the reservoir delta, where the muddy river is continually pushing more and more mud into the clear lake, and that front is moving downstream at a rate of sometimes an average of over 100 feet per day, though it's very variable depending on water flows and sediment loads and the shape of the canyon and all that. So the question you're asking about the San Juan is really interesting, because the Colorado River Delta, the biggest one, is 130 miles from the dam at this point. But the San Juan Delta is closer to the main stem of the Colorado. So it's going to reach the confluence of the Colorado likely long before the Colorado Delta reaches that point. So if when that happens, the Lake Powell will kind of be divided into two, with a big plug of mud in the middle of it, because these deltas they just keep filling and pushing as they go. So when the San Juan meets the Colorado, it will take this really deep main channel of the lake, fill it with mud, and then it might be hard to get motorboats from like Bullfrog to Page anymore. It's not kind of hard to picture exactly what it would look like and how long it would take. They might need to be dredging to open up a channel there to get boats through. That dredging would have to be repeated pretty consistently, because the mud will just keep filling in there. It'll take 700 years, according to the latest estimates, for Lake Powell to completely fill with mud, so that the entire reservoir is mud, and there's a waterfall over the top of the Glen Canyon Dam. But these sediment issues are happening on a much quicker time scale, something that we could see in the next few decades if Lake Powell remains in place and remains low. You could see the Colorado stem of Lake Powell, cut into two by the San Juan. Though if Lake Powell were to be emptied, if the dam were to be modified, these mud glaciers would stop moving and pushing into the middle of Glen Canyon. That muddy water would flow through the Grand Canyons we're talking about, and you wouldn't have this progress of mud continuing to fill areas where it hasn't reached yet, and changing the timeline for recovery in Glen Canyon.
One of the other interesting things about those sediment fronts, due to some complicated geomorphology, specifically in the San Juan Arm, the upstream end of that sediment front is accumulating well above the historic lake level. And in fact, there are court decisions that require the lake not to impact above a certain elevation. But in the San Juan Arm specifically, we're now seeing impacts at or above that historic high elevation. Is there a way to manage that? Is there a way to that we should be thinking about those upstream impacts as well as the downstream impacts?
Yeah, the San Juan in particular is interesting because the San Juan has a really pretty steep gradient compared to other rivers, especially for a river without a lot of rapids on it. And as soon as you hit, or before you hit the high water mark of Lake Powell, the San Juan changes from a really quick moving river with a lot of riffles in it to just a sandbar filled slow zone. I think we could tell the audience, Morgan, that I ran into you out on one of these sandbars over the summer when I discussed the book with you and your husband out there, and so we saw it firsthand recently. And the sediment, since it's like there's a plug of sand and sediment in the river that's 60, 70 feet deep, and the water's slowing down and starting to drop sediment as soon as it makes that transition from fast moving stream to meandering sandbar alley. The sediment is continuing to move upstream, even above the high water mark of Lake Powell, and it'll eventually, maybe even if you're familiar with the San Juan, eat into Government Rapid, which is kind of the biggest rapid on the San Juan. Is a few miles above that point right now. I'm not an expert on the legal issues there, but the sediment is something that needs to be addressed and acknowledged. And for the San Juan scenario, the San Juan situation, it's not the hardest fix in the world. There's a waterfall that's occurred in the Domini Formation below this area that we're talking about, and if the river were put back into its historic bed, the sediment in this area would wash downstream and end up further down in Lake Powell. And sediment that's moving up above the high elevation mark in Lake Powell and eating into the San Juan River would stop consuming more of the San Juan. I think it should be acknowledged and recognized that we could address this issue in different ways without completely rethinking water management in the West, and the San Juan would be an easier fix than some.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I love the view that there are things that we can do besides the overarching huge issues that are currently occurring in our management decisions of these areas. One of the things that is really interesting to me, and as the book highlights, is that there's a tremendous amount of water lost from Lake Powell to evaporation and seepage. It's in an incredibly hot environment. It is in an incredibly porous sandstone. It's not a great rock to build a reservoir in. And so we're probably losing, I think, somewhere around 800,000 acre feet. In the upper basin, those system losses are accounted for under the upper basin compact. And they come somewhat directly out of our calculations of how much water the upper basin is entitled to and is using. In a basin that's overallocated somewhere between 2 to 4 million acre feet, and that amount is increasing every year, give or take, as climate change impacts water in the basin, that's almost a quarter of the shortfall that we're seeing basin-wide. This loss, how should we consider those system losses and potentially minimizing those as we look into the future for water management in the West?
We have a problem in the Colorado River Basin of not enough water. Obviously, we've had 24 years of drought, around 20% decline on average of runoff into the basin compared to the previous century. But we also have a problem related to that of too much reservoir storage. So right now, even after 2 pretty good snow years, if you were to take water from every single reservoir in the Colorado River Basin, Lake Mead and Lake Powell, the 2 biggest in the basin, and then smaller but still significant ones like Flaming Gorge and on the Green River, and Blue Mesa on the Gunnison, and Navajo on the San Juan, and all the little reservoirs below the Hoover Dam. If you were to take water from all those reservoirs and put them into Lake Mead today, Lake Mead would barely be full. So we just have way too much storage to know what to do with in the basin. And there's a lot of the smaller reservoirs are serving different purposes, but Lake Powell isn't really needed for reservoir storage based on the consumption, the demand we have for water throughout the basin, and the declining hydrology we have in the basin. So the evaporation is a really interesting issue because, as you mentioned, a big purpose of why Lake Powell was built and why people are hesitant to think about a future without it is because it is located just upstream from the political dividing line at Lee's Ferry between the upper Colorado River Basin and the lower Colorado River Basin. This is the line that was set in 1922 under the Colorado River Compact. It doesn't have anything to do with the actual watershed itself, but it's become really important because that's the point at which deliveries from the upper basin are measured to ensure that the compact is being met. So if there's been a discussion for a while about an idea called fill Mead first, which is fill Lake Mead up completely before you fill Lake Powell, and then if you need storage in Lake Powell, you could use that after Lake Mead is full. And since the year 2000, we wouldn't have ever really needed storage in Lake Powell because Lake Mead would serve that purpose enough on its own, or Lake Mead plus the smaller reservoirs upstream. So if that plan were to be pursued, the Colorado River Compact would have to be modified somehow so that the deliveries were measured in a different way than the water passing Lee's Ferry, which made sense in 1922 when you had to measure it at a certain point. But now we have different ways of measuring water, and you could essentially come up with 2 accounts in Lake Mead, an upper basin account and a lower basin account, and measure deliveries kind of on a spreadsheet as opposed to physically moving it downstream. And if there was savings in evaporation, and there would be savings, even if there weren't net savings, but there'd be upper basin savings by not having a bunch of evaporation in Lake Powell, that could allow the upper basin to maybe develop a tiny bit more water, or at least not take cuts as soon as the lower basin. The lower basin uses around twice as much water as the upper basin, and I think that would sweeten the deal a little bit for losing Lake Powell completely, or having its elevation capped at a lower level than is currently possible if there was the ability for the upper basin to not feel the effects of drought a little bit longer than the lower basin, not have to turn off canals as soon as the lower basin does, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It also seems like that it has the potential to be protective of Lake Mead, which has a slightly different dam design, but still has the same risk of reaching Power Pool and Deadpool as Glen Canyon. One of the things that your book talks about that I really appreciated was the economics of how the dam and these large projects work. And one of the issues that is regularly brought up is the cost of retrofitting Glen Canyon Dam, either to put in lower outlets or to remove the dam entirely. What are the costs of risking not doing that?
Yeah, I think it's a really important issue. In April of 2023, when we were at that low point on Lake Powell, we were just 30 vertical feet above minimum power pool. That's the point at which hydropower generation would stop from the Glen Canyon Dam, and water delivery would become much more difficult to the lower basin. There's just physical constraints based on the design of the dam that make it harder to pass enough water through the dam at lower elevations. That start to be really worrying to even people who might not be too interested in the cottonwoods and the willows that are coming back in Glen Canyon. Just from a strict water management standpoint, the design of the Glen Canyon Dam is an issue for the lower basin, because there's if Lake Powell were to reach minimum power pool or dead pool, or somewhere in between, even if you had the outlets fully open on the dam, there wouldn't be a way to deliver 8 million acre feet of water through the dam, just because there isn't enough pressure hydrologic head going through there. So the lower basin states of Arizona, California, and Nevada, as well as really powerful farmers in the Imperial Valley, all submitted comments to the federal government supporting the idea of modifying the Glen Canyon Dam. At least, it's doing the study, not necessarily doing the modifications themselves. That study began in 2022, and it would be expensive, most likely. I mean, it's also expensive to do what we're doing now, which we paid $4 billion. The federal government paid $4 billion to farmers to not farm under the Inflation Reduction Act. And that's a cost that would have to continue each year, whereas an actual modification of the infrastructure would be longer lasting. I don't know exactly what the price tag is on modifying the Glen Canyon Dam. Those studies haven't been fully released yet, but it is something that the lower basin especially is concerned about, and acknowledging that the dam might have to be redesigned in some form to allow water deliveries to continue is something that I think we shouldn't forget about just after two good wet years in the basin.
I'd love to discuss for a minute the recent programs that you just mentioned in the Upper Basin, at the System Conservation Pilot Program, as well as the programs that are ongoing in the Imperial Valley. These programs are exceedingly expensive. And one of the things that we've come to realize, and that has recently been highlighted by an irrigation company in Grand Junction, is that these programs and this conservation efforts have significant downsides, including increased dust production during windstorms, lack of push water for farmers and ranchers who are not participating in the program, so unintended damages to other users. And I'm just wondering about squaring the need to conserve and the cost of these programs and these unintended consequences and how they're designed.
Yeah, no one's really figured out exactly how to do what's often called demand management, where there would be voluntary, like I think they say, voluntary compensated temporary fallowing of fields for farmers. So the idea is during a drought year, you need more water in the stream, you need more water to supply cities or whatever it is, you need more water for ecosystems. You can allow farmers to opt into a program to not farm that year, and they'd be paid to do that, and that would happen on a year-to-year basis. But as you mentioned, it's very complicated with all the other consequences of that. And it might be the same situation you're talking about by Grand Junction in the Grand Valley, where some farmers participated in this program this year, and there was a question of whether that would allow, under the water rights system, more water to be diverted to the Front Range, across the Continental Divide, to the Front Range of Colorado, which would make the river even lower by the time it got to Grand Junction. So that's like a huge unintended consequence of trying to get more water in the stream. You pay a farmer not to farm, and then all of a sudden it's sucked across the Continental Divide and doesn't end up in the basin at all, and doesn't provide those ecosystem services throughout the first few hundred miles of the Colorado River, which it would have just getting to the farm in Grand Junction, right? And that doesn't appear to have happened this year, that there weren't increased trans-basin diversions because of the program, but it could have, and it's something that you need to look at for the people who are designing these projects. There's also a lot of trouble measuring water as it moves, especially at low water levels. Water's moving in and out of groundwater. It can take a really long time to transition between the two. And often when there's water savings in one place, somebody turns off their canal, it doesn't necessarily end up where you think it will end up, or it's hard to measure how that little bit of water actually moves through the system, or else somebody else uses more because they're allowed to under water rights. And then there's a whole nother set of issues around hedge funds that have bought a lot of farmland around Grand Junction. There's hedge funds who have basically published their little white papers, models for how to make profit off of water in the West, and leveraging these demand management programs is one of the places they see potential for revenue. So you could have basically taxpayers paying a bunch of money to hedge funds that own farms not to farm in dry years, and that doesn't seem like an ideal scenario either to me. Compared to paying small farmers not to farm is one thing, but just returning a bunch of profit to investors and on Wall Street in the name of conserving water is another thing that people in Colorado, the legislature in Colorado is looking at figuring out if there's a way to deal with that. So it seems necessary to figure out ways to reduce water use. I mean, it is just a fact that it is necessary because their demand is outpacing our supply and has been for a long time in the basin. But getting into the nitty gritty of how exactly you conserve water and what the impacts of those programs are is difficult in a lot of cases.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I'd like to jump back to the sediment real quick. One of the reasons that Lake Powell was finally approved and constructed is because the amount of sediment in the Colorado River and the amount that was accumulating in Lake Mead from its completion in the 1930s the rate was much, much higher than they had originally anticipated. And so Lake Powell was somewhat seen as a sacrificial area to protect Lake Mead. If that sediment is moved downstream and the dam is modified, what are the potential impacts on Mead, and are there potential solutions for those impacts?
Given a long enough timeline, every reservoir's fate is to completely fill with sediment, right? Unless you have a way to open the gates and let that sediment clear out for a century or so, which is what it would take on Lake Powell, and then close it back up and use it again. So it is an issue. That's probably one of the leading arguments, besides the loss of reservoir recreation on Lake Powell, for keeping the Glen Canyon Dam in place in some way, even if we're not using it for hydropower or water storage, were two of the major purposes when it was designed. I haven't seen a study on exactly how long it would take to see significant impacts in Lake Mead if the Glen Canyon Dam were decommissioned. So I'd be curious to know the timeline there. Like I said, 700 years for Lake Powell to fill up with sediment completely. Lake Mead, we might not really have to deal with the issue for quite some time. And there might be more pressing concerns in the interim of just getting water downstream to the 40 million people who rely on water throughout the Colorado River Basin, and the 27 million people who rely on water below the Glen Canyon Dam. So yeah, it's a concern. I think David Brower, when he was in his 80s, he debated Floyd Dominy. David Brower was the director of the Sierra Club in the 60s and a famous opponent of the Glen Canyon Dam. And he said, his plan that he presented was we should decommission or drill tunnels through the dam, around the dam, empty Lake Powell, and in 200 years, when sediment starts to become an issue on Lake Mead, we'll reconstruct close those tunnels on the Glen Canyon Dam and use Glen Canyon as a sediment trap again. But he said at least we'd have 2 more centuries to enjoy Glen Canyon. So as we've been discussing this whole interview so far, there's a lot of different ways you can come into this issue and different concerns you could have, different priorities you can have, and the sediment is one of them for sure. But it might be not the most pressing in the scheme of things in the near future.
Perfect. One of the operating policies currently that is ongoing is equalization. And for a long time, Lake Powell has been seen as somewhat of a buffer against the compact compliance obligations for the upper basin to the lower basin, which the view there is that Lake Powell can capture excess water in good years and hold that water for bad years to allow them to deliver the required water downstream. With equalization and how the lakes are currently being operated, is that how the lake is functioning, and is it providing that certainty to the upper basin?
I think to a certain extent it has been, but I think, since we got so close to minimum power pool last year, it's not providing it's not as much of a reassurance as it used to be. So I think that, the lower basin states have supported the study to potentially modify the dam. Upper basin states have not. They're still, all the water managers, water commissioners in those upper basin states are still always very pro Glen Canyon Dam from what I've heard in public. But I do think that there could be a win-win situation where, you wouldn't have to completely renegotiate the Colorado River Compact, but you would change the delivery point from Lee's Ferry to within Lake Mead, as I mentioned earlier. And the lower basin, we get the benefit of, reduced evaporation, less, as you said, less of a concern of hitting Deadpool on Lake Mead, because you'd only be managing levels on one massive reservoir as opposed to 2. And the upper basin could get the benefit of not having to worry about the compact call coming as quickly, and potentially not having to worry about taking water reductions during dry years until the lower basin has seen tons and tons of reductions. So that's what's emerged from the negotiation so far, is that the lower basin is saying, we use almost twice as much water. We're going to take more cuts in drier years, and the upper basin has been pushing back on agreeing to any firm cuts during dry years until a certain point is reached. And I think modifying the Glen Canyon Dam, doing Phil Mead first, would make it very, the upper basin could get a very strong agreement that allows them to use more water during dry years than the lower basin, if they make that major concession to kind of change the way the deliveries have been managed throughout the Colorado River Basin for over 100 years. But I might be dreaming there. I'm not in the water negotiation rooms, and I know there's a lot of people would think that's crazy to suggest that. Though I was at a conference for Western Slope water managers in Colorado, and kind of tepidly presented that plan, and I didn't get anyone come push back strongly against it. Some people said it was interesting, so maybe it's not completely insane. Groups like the Glen Canyon Institute have been talking about that sort of thing for a while.
I appreciate that you've also thought about that there may be other ways to manage this without throwing out the entire law of the river. And it's certainly a complicated issue that clearly I could talk about all day, and I could ask you questions about all day. I would just love to ask one more question. You noted that you're not in those negotiating rooms, and neither are most other people, including the tribes and a lot of the water users. There's no formal seat for tribes at the table, though they have rights to somewhere around 25% of the water in the basin. They've been denied access to that water and to that infrastructure. My last question would be, do you have a vision for how the post-2026 negotiations should be being conducted, or how the process might be rethought to not be quite so closed door and to be more inclusive?
There's a really interesting proposal that was put forward by Jack Schmidt and Eric Kuhn and John Fleck, three kind of big names in the Colorado River water policy arena, and they've proposed a adaptive management program for managing the Colorado River post 2026. This is something it's used for Grand Canyon and Glen Canyon Dam releases into the Grand Canyon, where you have a big group of people, scientists, tribal representatives, federal representatives, environmental groups, a bunch of other folks who are in a room kind of looking at the situation we're in the current moment, which is always changing, right? Based on something like a smallmouth bass getting sucked into the Grand Canyon and suddenly introducing a whole nother set of concerns for the environment down there. And they can make decisions kind of based around the current challenges. And so Jack Schmidt and his colleagues have proposed doing the same thing for managing Lake Powell and Lake Mead. So you could have a group of people with robust tribal representation, which hasn't happened and should happen. And instead of having a set like policy of we'll equalize the reservoir elevations in Lake Powell and Lake Mead, be able to make adaptive decisions from year to year that would add more flexibility. So I think that's an interesting idea. But overall, yes, the tribes certainly need a seat at the table, and they need a seat at the table for water management, also for the management of Glen Canyon National Recreation Area, I think. And as these settlements continue to get finalized, there's a big one in process right now with the Hopi and Arizona Navajo Nation and San Juan Southern Paiute. That will, I think, add more even flexibility to making these kinds of tough decisions during dry years, since tribes have more of an ability to lease water that they're not going to use to other users on a short-term basis than most water rights holders have. So yeah, I hope there's been some progress, far too late, made on that front. But I hope it continues, and it should.
Yeah, thank you. And where can people find your book?
It's published by Torrey House Press, which is a nonprofit press in Salt Lake City. You can find it anywhere books are sold. Local bookstore, library, it's good. You can order it directly from the publisher as well, or at any of the big online sites. Life After Deadpool, with 2 words in the Deadpool. Not Ryan Reynolds related.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of the On Land Podcast. To find show notes for this episode and others like it, check us out at onland.westernlandowners.org. Thanks for listening, and I hope you will join us again next time when we talk with other voices of stewardship in the American West.